Hello, welcome back to part 3, toe bearing. This one's loose, and in the last series I said we were going to replace this and I was going to show you how to do it. One thing you want to note is that it doesn't want to be loose in there like that. That's not good. Right, well this is the primary shaft and the spigot is on the end here, which fits in the spigot or toe bearing in the end of the crankshaft and not onto a flywheel. Taking this off, we're having a look and see the clutch plate with the engaged gearbox, and this will turn at different speeds when the clutch is open. And this is something to remember, this doesn't want to be loose or too tight. For a few pence more, when you've got your new clutch, also get a toe bearing and fit it to the crankshaft, replace it. It makes sense because the gearbox and the crankshaft need to be perfectly in line. This will ensure the life of your input shaft bearings just a little bit longer. Old trick here, soak the toe bearing overnight in some engine oil. You could use grease as a lubricant, but that dries out fairly quickly. However, lubrication is your choice. 300 TDI workshop manual will tell you to cut a thread in a spigot bush and use an impulse extractor to pull it out. Well, we're going to do this a different way. This involves pumping grease into the housing where the bush is and the end of the crank, and then using a suitable tool to hydraulically push out the bush like that. Okay, so the idea of getting this bush removed hydraulically is using something like EP grease and then getting something that will fit to almost touch the sides to fill up the space and then knock it in. I've got to emphasize here, these are old sockets and extensions that I'm using, and it's a matter of whacking it until it starts to move. You'll see here that the grease has come out the top through the socket, but it's also pushed the bush out. You might need to replenish this halfway through. However, you can see once it's started, it will continue and come out. That's hydraulic action. Easy as that. Look, it's out. I think you'll find this is described somewhere in a workshop manual. So once this is done, you need to remove all the grease. Don't leave any in there at all. For fitting the spigot bush back in, I've knocked up a tool simply for the fact that there isn't anything available, and this is another old socket and some washers, an M8 bolt and a couple of nuts. You can see here that the bolt's gone through, and it doesn't have to be too tight, just finger tight. And I've put a nut on the end. This will stop the threads getting damaged, and I can disassemble the parts afterwards. Right, you see that? Okay. You need to have a socket that's going to touch the bush sides or as close as you can get it. This will stop it from collapsing. And then it's a matter of knocking this in squarely into the recess or the bush housing or the spigot housing. So few taps and that'll slide in easily. It should do. Once that's home, then that's there. Okay, you can see that. Best thing to do is make sure that it's just below or flush to the spigot boss there. Okay, you can see that. That's good. If this is a good fit, then the gearbox will slip straight in and there won't be a problem. In this case, the bush is actually too good and there's air trapped behind this, as you can see, but it moves and it spins, and that is the main thing. It doesn't want to be tight. I'm cheating here and I'm using a file just to make sure it's got a little bit of a chamfer on it. You want to check, even if it's with your fingers, to make sure you haven't buckled the bush in any way. This will impede it from being pushed in. However, this goes in and it turns easily. It's a nice tight fit and it's not too tight. It's absolutely vital that the primary shaft turns in the toe bearing. Otherwise it would defeat the object of having a clutch. Of course, you will be aware that you need to fit the toe bearing before fitting the clutch assembly. Okay, that's that for our little tutorial, but before we leave I'll give you a few more tips. When it comes down to actually mating the gearbox to the engine, you have wiring which could get trapped in between the bell housing, flywheel housing, same as the piping. Good idea to get it strapped out of the way and tied off so it won't hinder you or get trapped. Believe me, if you get a fuel line stuck between the flywheel housing and the bell housing, you'll certainly know about problems then. Keep this area clear. You also ought to pay attention to the back of the engine. If there's a loom hanging at the back here, make sure it's not going to drop over. And when you make the gearbox up, like I'm doing here, make sure that the gap is even and it goes in straight. Then you'll be able to get it in. This gearbox is actually in gear, so I can turn the main shaft at the back there. Once it's engaged on the splines, it should push in very, very easily. And this just shows that my clutch is absolutely perfectly lined up. One thing I'm not going to recommend is the lubricant that you could use on the release bearing sleeve and the splines on the input shaft. Check your workshop manual for what they recommend, because it changes from time to time. Stay tuned to the Land Rover Toolbox videos. We've got plenty of stuff to show you and teach you. So until then, stay skillful.